This is a Forbidden Knowledge News premium episode. To get access to this full episode and many more, become a premium member. Visit forbiddenknowledge.news or just click the link in the description. All premium episodes are available on the movies section of our social media site. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight, my guest is Recluse, aka Steven Snyder. Before I bring him on, I want to thank sponsors, C60 Purple Power, which is a necessity for me now. I feel better than I have in years. I have more energy, better sleep. I've lost weight. The benefits are amazing. C60 is a super antioxidant. It eliminates free radicals. Check out their website to learn more. Click the link in the description, and you can use coupon code KNOWLEDGE10 to get 10% off your order plus free shipping. Tonight, I want to welcome back to the show Recluse, or Steven Snyder. He is the longtime curator of the VISUP, or VISUP website, which is dedicated to parapolitics and high weirdness in all their many forms. After nearly a decade in the blogging racket, he's branched out into podcasts. With Frank Zero of Zero Night, he co-hosts The Farm, a weekly podcast dedicated to parapolitics and synchromysticism. His first book was co-authored with Frank Zero, entitled Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, Post-War Nazis, Mercenaries, and Other Secret History. Tonight we're going to discuss his second book, A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment. Steven, welcome back. How are you doing tonight?
Doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me back, man.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Last time you were on, we talked about your first book, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, which ties into your new book because, of course, it involves some of the key players showing up throughout modern history when it comes to corruption, scandals, cults, conspiracies, assassinations, sex trafficking, culture creation, psychological warfare operations, and much more. And tonight we're going to discuss your new book, which covers a 6 decades old scandal, which is linked to both Epstein's ring and the assassination of JFK. But first, I'd love to get your thoughts on how things have progressed since we last spoke, which was in April of this year. A lot has happened since we've talked. The world has become more strange and surreal, and I feel like we're living in a really bad movie that just won't end. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing, but I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it's an inevitable conclusion of a lot of the things that have been playing out now for years. Ironically, I just did a presentation at the Strange Realities Con for the Conspiranormal guys, and the general gist of the presentation was that consensus reality has effectively totally broken down. I mean, it's been an ongoing project from various groups. I mean, some amateurs, some, affiliated with intelligence services and what have you. But I kind of go back to the enigmatic cybernetic cultural research unit at Warwick University in the 1990s, who really pumped the whole idea of accelerationism and what have you that's become so popular in certain circles now. The most infamous member of them was, of course, Nick Land, who became the spokesman for the neo-reactionary / dark enlightenment in recent years. But originally, they came together to apply cybernetic principles to the emerging communication technologies, specifically the internet. Of course, this would have been circa like 1993, 1994, when a lot of this stuff was just getting off the ground. And they came to the conclusion that the internet was melting down consensus reality. Certainly, I mean, in the infancy of it. That's a rather disturbing proposition. And I mean, now we're a good almost, quarter century now past that point. And then on top of that, I mean, you really have had the major rise of conspiratainment, which, again, is another form of, I think, essentially also melting down consensus reality. So, I mean, you're just being people constantly bombarded with so many narratives from the left, from the right. There is no more unity in how people perceive things effectively. I mean, historically, the gatekeepers of the establishment, I mean, they had so many cable networks, they had so many major publications and so forth. It was easy to create a coherent narrative to orient societies around. We really just don't have that anymore. Some of it, I mean, now is happening because of ongoing psychological warfare efforts. But then, of course, I mean, you've got a lot of amateur players in it too, kind of doing their own assault on reality, so to speak. So it's definitely heady stuff that we're living in right now. That's to be sure.
Yeah, it's coming at you from all angles every day. I try not to watch any of the news myself because it just melts my brain. But you got to just kind of keep your eye on some of the strangeness going on. But let's get into your book now. Your series of books. It's going to be a trilogy, right?
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about the overall scope of things. I guess we should start with kind of a brief review of your first book and how it ties into this next one.
Well, the first book was, kind of a collection of essays that I did, and then Frank had contributed to the introduction, and then the one on the RFID chip. One of the essays was on Colonia Dignidad. Another one was on the Mellon family. And then the third one was on the rise of the private military industry. The newest work ties in, of course, to the Mellon essay quite a bit because which William Mellon Hitchcock appears yet again in this particular work. I've written quite a bit about William Mellon Hitchcock. I'm hoping now that I've done this rather extensive take on him in a special relationship, I can finally be done with him for now. I mean, he is a quite a fascinating character, but yeah, it's been years now that I've been chronicling this guy, and I'm sick and tired of writing about the bastard. But also, of course, kind of getting back to the rise of the private military industry, I kind of focused more on Strange Tales of the Parapolitical on the recent developments in the private military industry. But in this particular work, I'm going back to really the foundation of the modern PMCs, how that got going, and all that good stuff. So, I mean, there is sort of that lineage there at play.
And I'm sure you did a full trilogy because just to focus on certain players like Epstein, for example, it wouldn't bring enough of the full picture, I suppose, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, originally when I had started it, I was thinking, it'll be one book. And then I think after writing about like 2 chapters or something like that, I was still in like the 1940s or something, and it was up to like 20,000 words already. And I was like, this just isn't going to work. If I tried to do this as one book, it's going to be like 300, 400,000 words. I mean, it's going to rival, War and Peace or something like that, Tragedy and Hope. So anyway, the decision was then made to break it into a trilogy where hopefully it would be more manageable for people who haven't spent a lifetime studying this kind of stuff. So yeah, the first one essentially is going to kind of chronicle things from the interwar years between the world wars up to Profumo in 1964. And then the second one, we're going to be getting into a bit in the, from the mid 60s, picking up into like probably the early 80s. And then finally, the third one will get in from the 80s up to the modern day and hopefully wrap up everything.
Now, obviously, there are different factions involved in this, and your book focuses a little bit on the right side of the power pyramid globalist faction. Now, let's talk about where do these factions originate? What are they? Could you kind of give us a little bit of a brief history on what we're dealing with here?
Yeah, well, that was kind of the whole purpose of writing the introduction to it, to sort of explain the American geopolitical situation. And I mean, really, the factions go back, I mean, practically to the founding of the country. Sort of the split between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, if you will. And there was always really a question of, what we were going to be more oriented towards. The Federalists saw us as, essentially reintegrating ourselves into the European community and trying to maintain close ties with Britain and the other colonial empires. And then conversely, the Jeffersonians were all about manifest destiny and the continuous westward expansion and so forth. And in a lot of ways, that's still, at the heart of a lot of the disputes between the ruling factions in this day and age. Manifest destiny continued pretty much unabated until, roughly the 1850s. By that point in time, we had established all of the, what is currently the continental United States. And then from there, things hit a bit of a snag with the Civil War, the whole period of Reconstruction, and then it really got going again with the rise of the McKinley presidency towards the end of the 19th century. And basically, then the question was, well, where are we going to continue Manifest Destiny? I mean, the only place left now is further into the Pacific to continue now to essentially try to bring colonization to Asia. And that was a big dispute. I mean, a lot of people always wanted a closer relationship with the old countries, with the UK, with France, and that type of thing. And once again, this became an issue in the aftermath of the Second World War. You had the communist insurrection that essentially turned into the Civil War, and finally the triumph of the Chinese Communist Party over there. You had the whole situation with the Eastern, most of Eastern Europe falling under the Soviets. The United States was the most powerful country in the world at the time, but we just did not have the military capabilities to hold off the communist advance in both regions of the world. So what are we going to do? That kind of led to a great debate. Ultimately, the point of emphasis was given to Europe. We tried to some extent in Asia, but after several decades and quite a bit of military expenditures, we basically were left with nothing on continental Asia and that region of the world except for a little toehold in Korea. So, that's been an ongoing issue, I would say, with a certain faction within the ruling establishment. And certainly in this modern day and age, once again, the question of Asia has become a major factor again. I mean, you're seeing this playing out right now with the, two factions within the elite in this country. Are we going to be more oriented towards Russia? Are we going to be more oriented towards the People's Republic of China? Certainly, I mean, if Trump wins, I would say that we're going to continue to see the endless jingoism against China, probably even ratcheted up a few levels. And if Biden wins, you're probably going to see, if not a total de-escalation of things with China, at least a little bit more of an emphasis going back to Russia. So, this is something that's really been with us as a nation from really the founding of the country, and it's still playing out in this current day.
Now, when it comes to your book, you point out the historical ties of, Skull and Bones to the American conservative establishment. Talk a little bit about that and how that's, so important to what ties into all of this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because, I mean, within the conservative establishment, you really have got kind of the two wings, the neocons on the one hand, and the really far right on the other hand. They would have been, I guess, termed isolationist, quote unquote, effectively, prior to the Second World War. I mean, of course, in this sense, isolationist was basically just saying we don't want to get involved in European colonial wars, but not so much in our own colonial wars in Asia or Latin America, but whatever. Anyway, as far as Skull and Bones goes, it goes back to a rather prominent bonesman named Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War under Taft and then later under FDR, lifetime Republican, but he was brought into FDR's administration to kind of smooth over some feathers as we were getting ready to go into World War II. And Stimson brought a lot of other bonesmen and other hawks into the War Department, which of course became the Defense Department not long afterwards, but also the State Department. A lot of these guys, like Harriman and these types of people, eventually became the kind of nucleus of a clique of foreign policy advisors known as the Wise Men. A couple of them were bonesmen, and the broader kind of foreign policy establishment, this professional foreign policy establishment that emerged at the end of the Second World War was, you know, in a lot of cases drawn for the ranks of Skull and Bones. But these guys were really hawkish, much more so than they're usually given credit for by many conspiracy theorists. Essentially, these were the guys who coined the whole concept of containment against the Soviet Union, as opposed to sort of UN-based globalism that was very much favored by the business community at the time. So these guys are in the administration of FDR. They continue to thrive in Truman. They continue to have a lot of presence in the Kennedy administration. But then their successors getting into the 70s have become very disillusioned with the Democrats. And effectively, they jumped ship and became the nucleus of what we now think of as the neoconservatives. Paul Nitze, for instance, would be a good example of one of the guys who was sort of groomed by these bonesmen in the War Department going back to the 40s, who eventually kind of became a leading neocon in the late 70s, early 80s. So that's kind of your genesis of the neocons. On the other hand, you've got your quote unquote isolationists, and the rallying point for this was Taft. I guess it was Robert Taft, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, William Howard, I believe, was his father who was the president. But Robert Taft was the major isolationist during the lead up to the Second World War. He was also known as Mr. Republican, and he effectively became the spokesman for this, movement in the aftermath of the Second World War. Though now they had rebranded themselves as more proponents of massive military intervention in Asia at this point, which was really always the objective in the first place. But Taft was really sort of the nucleus for now what we would think of as the America First types. Taft had never actually joined the America First Committee during the interwar years, but he was very favorably disposed towards it, to put it mildly, but ever the politician, he avoided actually directly aligning himself with it. But another interesting thing about America First, too, that's not really talked about is it had its origins actually at Yale University, which is, of course, where Skull and Bones was housed as well. Another big guy, and that was William Buckley, too, kind of a, I guess, midway point between the neocons and maybe some of the more far right-wing types. But Buckley, of course, the big publishing empire with the National Review, the author of Man, God, and Yale, and of course another rather infamous Bonesman. But it is really interesting, though, of course, with the way the Bonesmen are depicted by so many conspiracy theorists, even though arguably you could say that they've had a lot more of an influence on the Republican Party. I mean, certainly in the recent era.
Now, when it comes to Skull and Bones, and you just mentioned different conspiracy theories, what would you say is the actual occult aspect that is really actually practiced by the Skull and Bones in reality?
Well, I mean, it's really hard to say. I mean, even if they do so much of the old school stuff anymore, I mean, Skull and Bones really seems like it's a pretty marginal thing in this day and age. I mean, Bush, too, and Kerry really seem like they were the last wave of really prominent Bonesmen. Well, I guess, what is it, Trump's, was it Mnuchin or something? Somebody in the cabinet, I think, now is a Bonesman, but I mean, he's one of the only really recent ones I can think of. But in terms of the actual initiation rituals, I mean, what we've come out with, I mean, seems like a fairly standard practices that are used by a lot of cults. Certainly confession is a big part of it. The whole process of, what is it, getting naked in a coffin and essentially revealing some of your darkest secrets and so forth. I mean, this sort of confessional approach in a lot of my different dealings and research into cults is really common. I mean, you look at moral rearmament or the Unification Church to sort of give you examples of nominally Christian cults. It's a similar type of process. I know in moral rearmament, it was, what was it, spiritual surgery or something that one of the more or less favorably disposed people referred to as spiritual nudism. But yeah, I mean, a lot of times that is a major part of creating this sort of hold over followers, is putting them in a vulnerable situation like this, having them confess some of the most shameful things in their life, and then having that over them, as well as that sort of degrading experience to go with it. It's a very profound psychological thing that, I mean, really has been known to many cults in various forms for centuries now.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the mentality that goes on some of those higher levels and those initiations. Very strange to me. Earlier, you mentioned the rise of neoconservatism, and I'd like you to talk about. You wrote about the significance of the Roosevelt family on neoconservatism. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, oh yeah. yeah. Well, I mean, Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was essentially the patron saint, really, if you want to get down to it, of neoconservatism. I mean, very much America first, but I mean, American empire first. Just a major proponent of the massive military buildup of the United States, a major proponent of just manifest destiny, of the, white man's burden, if you will, the divine right of the United States to continue expanding ever into the West. Roosevelt really brought a lot of rampant militarism. I mean, of course, it's always been to some extent evident in the country, but I mean, he really mainstreamed it a lot. And certainly the foreign policy gurus who had cut their teeth with him, I mean, they were another sort of part of this, clique that either became the wise men with those bonesmen and what have you that I was just alluding to. But this continued on. I mean, a lot of people don't realize it, but quite a few of his relatives would also end up in the CIA and in the Pentagon in senior roles. But I mean, some of the most notorious ones would have been Kermit Roosevelt or Kim Roosevelt, the coup master who had been involved in the Iranian coup, and also some of the intrigues in Egypt against the British and so forth. Another one was Archibald Roosevelt, who ironically was the CIA station chief at the time of the Profumo affair in London. He had also had some dealings with the coup in Iran back in the early 50s and so forth. So, I mean, he kind of brought this whole warrior mentality in a lot of ways into the Republican Party, and it was something that his family had continued onward with. And then, of course, there was I think his immediate son, Theodore Roosevelt II, who had been approached for the business plot, effectively to depose of FDR, going back into the 1930s. So, yeah, the whole history of that family is really fascinating, and you just don't really hear very much about them, even though they had a tremendous influence on shaping modern American foreign policy and effectively the American empire. And, again, he is very much the patron saint of neoconservatism and that whole mindset of this America dominated world.
Talk a little bit about the roundtable movement, specifically Quigley's roundtable, and how it plays all into this. I really wasn't familiar about this at all, and it's very fascinating.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Actually, Ed Operman just said that to me yesterday too. But yeah, the Roundtable movement was where, of course, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute for International Affairs comes from, Chapman House, all that good stuff. So, kind of some of these longtime bugaboos of the conspiratorial right. But the Roundtable movement had its origins with Cecil Rhodes and the Rhodes Trust. I guess originally he had created a kind of secret society. I think it was the Society of the Elect or something to that effect, to essentially bring the British Empire into a truly world government, if you will, with a major emphasis on reuniting the United States and the UK, and then using that as a basis for essentially forming a global commonwealth, if you will. Um, Though obviously, how much of an actual commitment there was to true globalism within this is debatable. I mean, as with many things, there were different factions at play within this whole movement. You did have some of the more idealistic types who did want something that we would later envision with the United Nations, but then certainly there were others who really had only ever desired a kind of Anglo-American empire, which they saw would have effectively been insurmountable for any of the other powers at the time. And this would essentially become a long-time fixation of the British establishment well after the Second World War had ended, and there really, at the time was no practical reason to think that it would even come about. But that was something going into the research that was very surprising. There had been this sort of longing for years and years for that, and certainly, as we're getting into the 21st century with the decline of American power combined with Brexit, which has now left, I mean, the UK kind of left adrift in a sense. Once again, I think that could be a major factor looking at plans long term for the elites in the United States and the UK. Right now, you were to combine the two forces, it would give you something that would certainly pose a more formidable challenge going forward to the more volatile 21st century, if you will. And we might even have gotten a preview of this, going into the Bush 2 years and the the so-called coalition of the willing in Iraq.
Now, you get into some of the origins of what is now considered Epstein's blackmail ring, and some of the shady dealings that was going on. When did this kind of form? And talk a little bit about the origins of that.
Well, I mean, it's probably been around in some form or another for a very long time, but I mean, I think a lot of it was adapted from the British system, and it kind of grew out of this informal intelligence network, effectively, that the British kept in the U.S. In the interwar period. The head of it was Sir William Wiseman, who incidentally had actually been Crowley's handler in New York during the First World War. He had effectively been the head of all British intelligence in North America at the time. Afterwards, he theoretically retired from MI6, but seems to have, essentially kept this informal ring going. It was centered around these very exclusive gentlemen's clubs, such as the Room, which was in New York City. You had some kind of counterparts in the UK, like the Travelers Club. There was the Ends of the Earth Club, if I remember correctly. But these were, in some senses, kind of these, hoity-toity explorer clubs. A lot of, Anglo-American WASP types would get there and talk about their travels to Antarctica and that type of thing. But they did have value in enabling the British to keep tabs on what was going on in their various far-flung regions of the world. And of course, also it gave them access to many of the pillars of the American establishment. So it was another way to keep dibs on what they were doing. And this informal network really was what was brought out into the open as the full-blown intelligence services here during the Second World War. William Donovan had really cut his teeth, working in these gentlemen club circuits in the interwar years. And the other Bill, of course, who was significant to all this, was William Stevenson, Sir William Stevenson, the head of the British Security Coordination. I mean, he was another guy who had used these contacts in the gentlemen's club circuits. He came over to this country and he effectively took over Wiseman's role as head of British intelligence in North America. And he was really the guy, more than anything, who launched these blackmail rings. And specifically, when he got going on them, it was to get the United States initially to aid the British in their war efforts, and then later to enter the war full blown on the side of the Allies. So, this went to the lengths where they had effectively entrapped a prominent isolationist senator, Arthur Vandenberg, with several mistresses that British intelligence had supplied, and he was blackmailed to support Lend-Lease. And then later, in the aftermath of the war, to forgive many of the debts to the British. And it's just really amazing, in this day and age with Russiagate and, all of the questions about foreign interference in this country. I mean, if you really want to get down to it, Stevenson is the guy who wrote the book on rigging elections in this country. I mean, besides entrapping politicians through, these various women, the guy would hire fake protesters to go and troll the America First committee rallies. He would stalk them. I mean, he would send harassing letters to them. He would have exposés, written in newspapers about them if they had dug dirt up on them. He rigged polls. I mean, one of the major guys for Gallup was an agent of the British Security Coordination. So, you hear all of this stuff now that the left and the right both blame each other for, in terms of how elections have been undermined in this country, or they blame the Russians for, or whatever. A lot of this goes back to the British guys. And incidentally, the British, along with the Israeli prime ministers, are the ones who get to address our Congress, certainly not the Russians.
Yeah, it definitely does seem that way, that it goes back to the British and Israelis very often. Now, you mentioned the British Security Coordination. Talk a little bit more about its head, Sir William Stevenson, and it's actually very relevant today, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the British Security Coordination, more than anything, is what the modern day CIA was based upon, and I mean, it was really a revolutionary institution at the time. I mean, Britain, at the onset of the Second World War, they had MI6, which is their foreign intelligence service. They had MI5, which was their domestic one. The Special Operations Executive, which did, the black stuff, the assassinations, bombings, that kind of crap. And then you had the Political Warfare Executive, which was their psychological warfare Fair Thing, and a couple of other agencies. But I mean, essentially, it was just this, whole litany of different agencies that were doing these different tasks, and there was a lot of overlap. There was a lot of institutional rivalry, and the SOE absolutely hated MI6 and vice versa. So anyway, when Stevenson set up his operation in North America, he basically combined all of these functions with the British security coordination. You're doing foreign intelligence, you're doing your counterintelligence, you're doing your propaganda, your covert operations. It's all sort of rolled together under one umbrella, so to speak. And that was the model that he passed on to Donovan for the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. And then obviously that was also the model that we later used for the CIA. And that's kind of something that a lot of people don't realize. I mean, in the UK, for instance, they did sort of roll together some of the things like covert operations with foreign intelligence, but you still have a pretty significant divide between like the counterintelligence functions of MI5 versus the foreign policy or the foreign initiatives that MI6 embarks upon. Whereas, I mean, the MFBI here does do some counterintelligence stuff, but I mean, a lot of the major stuff is still handled by the CIA, and a lot of that ultimately was Stevenson's vision. This sort of Byzantine, all-seeing intelligence service that could do all of these different functions.
Now, eventually, the BSC and the OSS are dismantled. What happens to these networks after supposedly they're dismantled or shut down?
We obviously, you had that 2-year gap, effectively, where the OSS is gone. There's no CIA yet until 47, and then on the other side of the pond, MI6 is still there. But as I kind of said before, there have been major rivalries with the special operations executives, some of these other branches. MI6 doesn't want a lot of these guys, but now you've got a situation where all of this quote unquote talent is on the street, and a lot of the major spy masters, a lot of the major players realize that we're already heading towards the Cold War. They've got to figure out somewhere that they can stash these assets. And that's what led to the rise of these, kind of private intelligence networks that have become so prevalent in recent years. But at the onset, they really became a necessity for simply stashing away these assets. I mean, of course, the major one was the World Commerce Corporation, which William Donovan would become a director of in the post-war years. Sir William Stevenson would become a director of. Another guy involved with it who was really significant was Sir Charles Hambro, who had headed the Special Operations Executive. And I mean, these were, again, directors, the senior guys overseeing all that, who then shifted gears into this enigmatic private company. And then, of course, they were joined with a host of veterans from the BSC, from the SOE, from the OSS. I mean, almost all of the major figures in the World Commerce Corporations were spies. And it does seem that effectively the purpose of these companies was to fill the gap until a proper intelligence service could be established in the US, and funding to some extent could be procured for these services in the UK.
Now, speaking of spies, I find this very interesting. Talk a little bit about Betty Pack, or codename Cynthia, who supposedly, helped defeat the Nazis.
Yeah. She was Stevenson's principal sexpionage agent, I guess, if you will. She was used to seduce multiple individuals at several embassies. I think initially it was like the Polish embassy, and then, of course, when she was sent back to America, she had been used to seduce multiple people in the French embassy, I guess, at the time. And it was later credited as being quite significant for Operation Torch, which was the Allied invasion of North Africa. She was credited with managing to come up with some pretty significant intelligence and the landing, and assisting us in keeping the casualties down, if I'm not mistaken. But she was a very interesting figure. She was actually an American girl, even though most of her work had been with British intelligence. She had come from a fairly high society type family, I believe, especially with her mother. Had kind of grown up in those exclusive sects and, the old Eastern establishment haunts, if you will. She became sexually active at quite a young age. I think she had lost her virginity at like 13 or 14 to a 25-year-old Irish lad or something to that effect. So, there was already that kind of, decadence, if you will, in her life at a very young age. And then, of course, she did go into this more specific kind of work when she did become involved in espionage later.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Talk a little bit about, well, first of all, tell us what exactly the World Commerce Corporation is and how that also ties into everything.
The WCC, like I kind of alluded to before, it was used to stash all of these, these former spooks and what have you. And, they got up to some pretty shady business. Of course, they were partly established to kind of fill the void left by the German cartels, so to speak. But that raises some interesting possibilities. Of course, they established very close ties with the government of Taiwan. Not long after the Communist Chinese had prevailed in the Civil War. Taiwan is basically an apartheid country. The nationalist Chinese were driven off the mainland. They constitute about 10% of the population. They took over Formosa, made it into Taiwan, and ruled it as effectively a one-party dictatorship for about 50 years or so. And arguably, it hasn't advanced much beyond that. But also, it was for many years one of the major drug centers of the world. The ruling political party, the KMT, was deeply implicated in heroin trafficking for many, many years. And it's quite likely that the World Commerce Corporation was instrumental in reestablishing this drug trade and possibly more activities related to that. Of course, they owned quite a few pharmaceutical companies, and in this era, it was not uncommon for illegal heroin to kind of make it in one way, be refined into morphine or something, and then kind of be lost in the shuffle and end up back in the hands of organized crime. Something that's not really talked about a lot, but quite a bit of the illicit narcotics had been provided by major cartels, German cartels, in the years leading up to the Second World War. And the World Commerce Corporation might have also been filling that void as well, among other things. There's been speculation, of course, that they were also used for those kind of Gladio networks that were set up in Europe afterwards. So in the World Commerce Corporation, it did a lot of shady stuff besides just, providing the CIA and MI6 a place to keep these invaluable assets at. I mean, it could also do a lot of off-the-books activities that would have been difficult for the official intelligence services to do. I mean, of course, the CIA needed plausible deniability. MI6 needed that too. But I mean, also the fact that the UK just wasn't as formidable as the Americans were at the time. They certainly needed even more distance.
Yeah, it seems like the WCC, was basically a giant drug dealing business with a few legitimate business fronts, right?
Yeah. I mean, it laundered some money. I mean, it also did just weird stuff like barter trade. I mean, I think it had arranged for, what was it, like Hungary, which was a communist country, to like provide paprika or something like that for medical supplies from like Austria, or just, yeah, it was very strange. I mean, on the one hand, it kind of seemed like it was doing some of this legitimate barter trade. On the other hand, it's trying to help the KMT continue being major international drug traffickers. I mean, it wore a lot of hats, let's just say.
It also had links to the blackmail rings.
Yes, I mean, it does seem like that. One of the early presidents, John Pepper, had actually been one of the major guys involved in those blackmail rings, with Stevenson with the British Security Coordination. In fact, Pepper had actually been Betty Peck, Cynthia's handler, at one point during, I think it was like the late 30s, early 40s. He eventually became the head of the World Commerce Corporation. And then there was another leading American figure, Ricardo Sicri, I believe is how his name is pronounced. But this guy had actually been used as a sexpionage agent himself. Actually, he had seduced quite a few secretaries at the Spanish embassy, and had procured access codes or something like that to their safes from them. So he himself had extensive firsthand experience working in blackmail operations.
Now, eventually, this relationship between U.S. and UK intelligence began to break down. Could you talk a little bit about how that came forth?
Yeah, well, I mean, really, the flashpoint was the Middle East. East. I mean, of course, the America had not had a lot of dealings in the Middle East up till that point in time in history, i.e., the Cold War, going into play. Previously, I mean, the Middle East had really been the dominion of the European powers. I mean, we had a bit of a toehold, let's just say, in Saudi Arabia, but that was about it. Now, of course, World War II happens. The European powers are decimated. Their colonial empires begin to recede. And in many cases, we were more than happy to try to, make that happen even faster. Basically, we wanted to try to get our own crony client states set up there to replace the ones that the British or the French had been using. And initially, this sort of started to become a factor in the whole issue with Iran. It's usually now depicted as being principally an American operation, but really it was the British who had gotten the ball rolling on overthrowing the prime minister who had been elected there and then replacing him with the Shah. Of course, the UK had ultimately had to go to the United States and ask for help. Originally, we didn't do that under Truman, but Eisenhower was a little more receptive. However, the cost was a cut of the oil. Up to that point, what eventually became BP, it effectively had a monopoly on Iranian oil, so they had to start giving up a cut of the pie. And then, of course, things really came to a head in Egypt a couple of years later with Nasser. We had effectively backed Nasser, and we had sponsored Odo Scherzini to effectively bring a lot of former Nazis there to help train his intelligence service, his military, and provide other expertise, quote unquote. Which is interesting because Scherzini had actually become a kind of partner for the World Commerce Corporation by that point in time. But anyway, that did not sit very well with the British. And of course, at the same point in time, you had guys like Charles Hambro, who were effectively working to overthrow Nasser on behalf of the British. So, I mean, it was almost kind of an institutional civil war between different guys aligned with the World Commerce Corporation in Egypt. So eventually the British, make an arrangement with the French, with the Israelis. The Israelis stage an invasion effectively, and that provides the British and the French pretext for to deploy paratroopers there. Everything's looking good so far. They think they're finally going to get rid of Nasser, but unfortunately, there's kind of a run on the British pound. They're starting to run out of oil. They don't know where they're going to get the money to get more, and they come to the United States and ask for a loan to tide them over while the war is ongoing, and the U.S. says no. And that basically marked the end of the British Empire because they had no way to continue this conflict and effectively had to acknowledge that they were wholly dependent on the Americans to project any kind of power. And if the Americans were not going to sponsor them in this, then they had no means of continuing the fight. It was just devastating for the British, and certainly it led to a whole kind of stab in the back mythos in certain segments of the British establishment as well. So that was a big thing for them, and it really, led to a break also with the relations between the intelligence services, between a whole factor of things. And for many years afterwards, it was kind of a preoccupation of the British establishment, how they could, maintain some degree of independence, especially in terms of their foreign policy, while being so dependent on the Americans for so many things.
This is a Forbidden Knowledge News premium episode. To get access to this full episode and many more, become a premium member. Visit forbiddenknowledge.news or just click the link in the description. All premium episodes are available in the movies section of our social media site.